Next on our list is the while loop. So a couple of things here to take note of in before we even get to the code. For the while loop versus the for type loop. So I'm just going to go through here and take a look really quickly at our pre versus post increment evaluation example one more time, just to give us a frame of reference here for the while loop. So here on lines 35 through 38, we have a for loop. And you will notice that everything we need to maintain our looping structure is right here on the first line in the instantiation statement. That's bad coffee. Is here in our loop instantiation statement. So here we have our keyword for. That is letting the environment know, okay, set aside some space, we are going to create a for loop. Now here inside of those parens is everything we need to maintain the loop, is everything we need to iterate through our loop, and is everything we need to finally exit from our loop. So what we do is here, the first of the arguments that we have here inside of our for loop, int I equals 0, that is pretty standard, and it's essentially shorthand for create an integer, I for increment, and set it to 0. This gives us logic to break out of our loop. The second argument says I less than 10. When this argument evaluates as false, we can finally leave the for loop. And finally, I++, what this suggests is when we have come to the end of the code block for our for statement, that we are going to increment the counter, and that counter again is I. So everything we need is right here in our for loop. So in the instance of it, we create in this case, an integer variable to help us maintain how many iterations we're going to go through. The second argument here gives to us a means to test for false so that we can finally break out of our loop. And here we have the increment statement where we are adding 1 to our increment. So sooner or later we actually can evaluate that second argument as false and get the heck out of here. So this is the while loop. It's our second example here. And for the time being, this is going to be very, very simple. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this so we can see what's going on. And all of the function here for this particular little while loop is as follows. So let's walk our way through here. We have int number equals 0. So this is what we are going to use, the variable that we are going to use to actually step through the iterations of our while loop. You could certainly call this counter. I actually suggest to you that's far better a variable name than is number. So int number equals 0 could just as well or should just as well be int counter equals 0. Here we have the structure of our while loop. All while loops have the following things in common. I'm just going to type them under here. They start with while. That's our keyword. Next would come the open and close parentheses. Inside of the open and close parentheses is our argument. That provides us something that we can test that sooner or later will be false. And then after that will come a code block. So whatever is between these curly braces is our block of code for this particular while loop. So that is the structure of every while loop you'll put together. The argument I have is while number is less than 5. So since I started at 0 and I said less than 5, I'm going to get 5 iterations through this loop. But just again, to really point out and hammer home here the idea of good programming design, when you're working with a user, is the first line here, this is number 0. Does that really make sense to them? No, right? Because every user is accustomed to starting the counting with number 1. that's something we absolutely positively should still be recreating for them. My suggestion to you is here on line number 9, inside of our loop, instead of just outputting number, if you output number plus 1, this is going to look a lot better from the user's perspective. So if I run that again, now I have number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that's much more normal for what the user experience is going to be. So let's get back to our loop as opposed to just good user-facing design. So if the whole point of this particular looping structure is to report to the user what number it is that we are iterating through here, what we need is this iteration statement. If you'll remember our for loop, so let me go ahead and just open this one again. Our for loop takes care of that for us here with its third argument, the incrementation argument, I++. The while statement does not take care of this for us. If we do not include number plus plus, we are going to create here a situation called an infinite loop. Now, this is what I'm going to do, and I can tell you that the output is going to be less than satisfying here. So just as kind of a marker here, I'm going to refresh the page. So what this does is it actually reloads in the far right hand portion of our window here. This has reloaded our particular piece of code. And if I run it, look how long it takes until we get output. Moments, right? Under 3 seconds until we get an output. Now, this is what I'm going to do. On line number 11, and if you're following along with this, you can do the same thing, would be to comment out line number 11. So I'm on a Mac, and that's command /. But if you're on a PC, it's control /. Now, what I expect here to happen is as follows. So before I even hit the run button, I will tell you, number one, we are going to make Replit angry. The reason for that is if we go through this while loop now, number is less than 5. That's the condition we're testing for to make it possible to exit from this while loop. If number is never incremented, number will always be 0. First iteration through, number is 0. Second iteration through, number is 0. Third iteration through, number is 0. This is a problem. We have no way of getting out of here. So I'm going to run this again, and I'm just letting it run. You'll notice it stopped, right? So hello, this is number 1, number 1, number 1. Really, it didn't stop. What happened in the background here is Replit caught the fact that this was an infinite loop, and essentially it's stressing out. So watch. You'll notice if I come to stop and hit stop, when you hit stop ordinarily, it stops instantly, right? I'm not sure if you can hear the clicking. Click, 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 click. It ain't stopping. This is not stopping. This window had an allocation of memory given to it, some finite amount of storage on the server side and some finite amount of storage here inside of this Opera window. I'm actually using Opera because it gives me slightly more control over how much JavaScript resource allocation I give here. I'm still hitting stop, and it ain't stop. If I come over here to my reload tab, you'll notice it's still reloading. It's not actually reloaded. You'll notice my output window has stayed the same. Replit cannot reload this window because that applet is, or that application rather, is still running on the server side. If I come up here to try and close the tab, that took a while to close. We created there an infinite loop, which is expressly what we don't want to create as a situation. My suggestion to you, and after years of programming, this is something that I still have a reflexive ability or a reflexive nightmare of having, is having created enough infinite loops. Every time I start a while counter, this is what I can tell you I'll do. So I'll code it down here. So I'll begin the while, and I'll have whatever my condition is here inside of my parens. I will, create whatever the code block is that goes inside of my while loop. So I'm going to say that probably I would never call it count. I would never call it number. I would call it counter. More specifically than that, I would call it example counters or something more descriptive, because you're going to use more than one counter over the course of a development. So while counter is less than 5, the very next thing I always do is come back into the code block that belongs here to this while statement, and I give myself counter, if I can spell it correctly, plus plus. Because this way I know I cannot get distracted and forget about giving myself the iteration statement, so that sooner or later I can actually get out of my while. So I have broken enough in my career to know that in order to manage my own failures, essentially, when I create a loop, when I create the logic that will help dictate that loop, the very next keystrokes I do are take whatever that argument is and make absolutely certain I have created a situation where we can actually get out of that particular loop. So that is the while loop. It is unlike the for loop in that we need, number one, outside of the while statement, we have to declare some variable that will help us manage how many iterations we're going to go through this loop. Next, when we set up our while statement, we need to provide ourselves with some kind of logic that will allow us to exit the loop. So in this case, number less than 5. Number 3, we need to increment a counter. We need to be able to give ourselves a way at some point in time for this while loop and this argument to evaluate as false, so we can come down here to the next line in the flow of control. In this case, it's line number 13, where it can say that is all. Because I have added these lines for you. So I'll get rid of these. We'll run it again. And this is a slightly more satisfying conclusion than the infinite loop would have otherwise been.